The floorboard came up easier than it should have. Mara Whitfield knelt in the empty upstairs hallway of her grandmother's farmhouse, pry bar in hand, sawdust drifting gold in the late afternoon light, and felt the board give way with a soft, tired sigh, as if it had been waiting, for a very long time, for someone to finally lift it. She sat back on her heels in the dust and the dying light, and stared at her own name, her name, written on paper that felt older than she was. Written, she would soon learn, 30 years before she had been born. For a long moment, Mara didn't move. Outside, the wind pushed through the maples that lined the long gravel drive, and somewhere down in the kitchen, a pipe ticked as it cooled. The house, her grandmother Eleanor's house, empty now for the first time in 61 years, settled around her the way old houses do, with a kind of patient, watchful quiet. 3 weeks earlier, this hallway had been nothing but a chord. In the stretch of scarred pine floor she'd measured twice for new boards, a punch list item between patch the plaster and check the gutters. She had come to Miller's Hollow with a clipboard and a plan, determined to treat the whole project the way she treated everything since the divorce, efficiently, without too much feeling attached, one task crossed off after another, until the house was ready to list and she could go back to her apartment in Boston, and her job at the architecture firm, and the life she had built to be quiet. And the first surprise had come during her second week, when she'd pulled up the rotted carpet in what used to be her grandmother's sewing room, and found, tacked to the underside of the baseboard, a child's height chart going back to 1974, her father's initials climbing the wall in faded pencil, then, decades later, her own. She had sat on the bare floor for 20 minutes that afternoon, tracing the marks with one finger, feeling the strange vertigo of being both the person who made those marks and the stranger uncovering them. Someone had believed it so completely that they had hidden a letter beneath a floorboard on the strength of that belief alone, and then waited, through decades, through weather, through the slow decay of everything else in the world, for her to arrive. Mara had come to Miller's Hollow, Vermont, 3 weeks earlier with a truck full of drop cloths and a folder of receipts, intending only to fix up her late grandmother's farmhouse enough to sell it. She had told herself it was practical, The house was too big for Mara was the only family left who wanted the house instead of the money it would bring. She had not expected to find anything except peeling wallpaper and mouse nests in the walls. She turned the envelope over in her hands. It was sealed, properly sealed, with a wax stamp gone brittle and cracked down the middle, the impression worn too smooth by time to make out clearly. A letter W, maybe, or an E. Her thumb. He'd been the one to tell her, gently, that she didn't have to keep the farmhouse, that Eleanor herself had said, more than once toward the end, that the place should go to whoever loved it enough to stay. Mara doubted her father even remembered the little locked door at the end of the hall. He'd grown up in this house and left it behind at 18, the way young men from small towns often did, without much looking back. If she called him now, breathless, holding a letter addressed to her by name in handwriting older than her own existence, some part of her, some old, careful instinct she didn't fully trust yet, told her this letter wasn't meant to be shared before she understood it. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Then, from somewhere below her, she heard it, the long, low creak of a door. Mara went still. She knew every door in this house by now. She'd oiled every hinge, catalogued every stuck latch, replaced the knob on the pantry door herself. There was no door in this house that made a sound she didn't recognize. Except one. At the end of the hallway, past the room that had been her grandmother's sewing room, past the linen closet with the mismatched towels, there was a door that had never opened in all the time Mara had spent in this house. Not this visit, not any visit in her memory, going back to childhood summers spent chasing fireflies across the back field. It was smaller than the other doors, tucked into an alcove as if the house itself had tried to make it forgettable. The old brass key had never turned in its lock, not once, not for her father, not. Old houses breathed like that, shifted like that, especially with a storm coming in off the ridge. But she found herself walking toward it anyway, letter pressed to her chest, past the pale rectangle on the wallpaper where a photograph must have hung for decades before someone took it down. The door was closed, locked, same as always, silent, same as always. Mara stood in front of it a long moment, feeling foolish, feeling something else she didn't have a name for yet. Then she went back to the fallen floorboard, sat down against the wall with her knees drawn up, like she used to sit as a girl, and broke the seal. Mara knew it instantly. She had spent childhood summers watching that same careful, slanted hand fill out recipe cards and birthday tags, and the little notes Eleanor used to leave in Mara's suitcase before she drove back to Boston. Drive safe. Call when you're home. I love you more than pie, which is saying something. This handwriting was younger, less certain, but it was hers. My dear girl, if you are reading this, then the years have done what I always believed they would, and you have come back to this house, and you have found the place I hid this letter 30 years before you ever drew breath. I know how strange that must sound. I have turned this letter over in my mind for 3 decades, wondering what you will think of an old woman's certainty. But some things a person simply knows, the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop falls. I knew you would come. I knew your name before your mother did, and I have waited a very long time to tell you why. It is exactly where I put it, and I am trusting that if you have found this letter, you will also find your way to it, because I have always believed, that you are the only person who was ever meant to open that door. You see, things aren't sequential. Good doesn't lead to good nor bad to bad. People steal, don't get caught. Live the good life. Others lie, cheat, and get elected. Some people stop to help a stranded motorist and get taken out by a speeding semi. There's no accounting for it. How you play the cards you're dealt, that's all that matters. Eleanor had been 22 in the autumn of 1961, working the register at Colby's General Store on Miller's Hollow's single paved road, when a young man walked in out of a rainstorm carrying nothing but a canvas duffel and a look on his face like he'd left something important behind and wasn't sure he'd ever get it back. His name was Samuel Ward. He'd come up from Springfield to help his uncle run the sawmill for a season. He said, though Eleanor would later learn that wasn't the whole truth, that Samuel had left Springfield the way a person leaves somewhere they can't stay, quietly and without much warning, because his father had You see, thumbs answer question. But doesn't lead to good nor bad to bad. People steal, don't get caught. Live a good life. Others lie, cheat, and get elected. Some people stop to help a stranded motorist and get taken out by a speeding semi. There's no accounting for it. How you play the cards you're dealt, that's all that matters. He had a way of listening, Eleanor wrote, that made a person feel like the only interesting thing in a room full of interesting things. I remember once, early on, telling him about a dream I'd had. Nothing important, just some nonsense about losing my shoes at a county fair. And a full week later he brought up a small detail from it, some offhand thing I'd said and forgotten I'd even mentioned. I asked him why on earth he'd remembered that. He said, because you told it to me, Ellie. Anything you tell me, I keep. They made a promise to each other in July of 1962, sitting on the porch of this very farmhouse, which had belonged to Eleanor's parents. Samuel had asked her to wait for him. He'd been drafted, not overseas yet, but training was set to begin that autumn, and no one in 1962 could say with certainty where a young man might end up next. He gave her a ring that had belonged to his mother, too small a stone for anyone to notice, unless they knew to look, and he told her that when he came home, that's something I have carried for 64 years, and something I am only now, in the writing of this letter, allowed to set down. He said, if we ever have a daughter, we name her after your mother, but if we're lucky enough, someday, for a granddaughter, I want her named Mara. It was my mother's name, and she was the finest woman I ever knew besides you. Promise me, Ellie, whatever happens to either of us, if there's ever a girl in this family with that name, she'll know she was loved before she was even a thought. Her own middle name, Eleanor had always called her my Mara girl, suddenly felt less like a family tradition, and more like the last surviving piece of a vow made 64 years before she was born. She thought of her grandmother, sharp and funny and endlessly practical, baking bread every Sunday of Mara's childhood, never once mentioning a man named Samuel Ward. She kept reading. Samuel shipped out in September. He wrote every week for the first 4 months. Eleanor still had the letters, tied with kitchen twine, in a box Mara would later find in the cedar chest at the foot of her grandmother's bed. Mara set the letter down for a moment, drawn by something between grief and instinct, and crossed the hall into her grandmother's bedroom. The cedar chest sat exactly where it always had, beneath the window, its lid worn pale in a rectangle where decades of forearms had leaned against it. She lifted the lid slowly, the way you'd open something that might be sleeping. Beneath a folded quilt and a stack of Christmas linens, she found the box the letter described, a plain tin, rust freckling its corners, holding perhaps 30 envelopes bound with twine gone brittle and grey. Some instinct told her they weren't hers to read line by line, not tonight, maybe not ever, that some things were meant to be known only in outline, the way Eleanor's letter was giving them to her now, rather than picked apart word by a stranger 60 years removed. But she held the bundle a long moment, feeling the ordinary weight of it, 22-year-old Samuel Ward's careful handwriting visible in fragments through the yellowed paper. Dearest Ellie, she could make out on the topmost envelope, and nothing more. The house had gone very quiet around her, the kind of quiet that feels less like silence and more like listening. And then, in the deep cold of February 1963, the letters simply stopped. I told myself it was the mail, Eleanor wrote. Army mail was never reliable, and I had heard of men whose letters arrived 8 at a time after months of nothing. I told myself that every single day for a year, and then my father sat me down at this kitchen table, and told me that Samuel Ward had been reported missing during a training exercise gone wrong in the mountains outside his posting, and that the search had been called off after 11 days. Not for a long time I wore that small ring on a chain under my collar for 2 more years, and I told anyone who asked that I was simply waiting for the right time. But time does something to grief if you don't let it move. It doesn't heal, exactly. It just changes shape. By 1966, my mother was ill. My father needed help running this farm, and a kind, steady, entirely unremarkable man named Walter Whitfield had been calling on me for the better part of a year, with a patience I did not deserve and did not, in truth, ever fully return. I want you to know that I loved him, not the way I loved Samuel, but in the way a person learns to love the life they actually have, instead of the one they imagined. Walter was good to me for 31 years. He gave me your father. He never once asked me about the ring I kept in the bottom of my jewelry box, though I believe, near the end, he knew. I tell you all of this not to break your heart, Mara, but because none of it is the part of the story that matters most. The part that matters most. A letter arrived that autumn, Eleanor continued, forwarded through 3 different addresses before it found me, in an envelope so worn I almost mistook it for junk mail and nearly threw it in the stove without opening it. It was from a woman named Dorothy Marsh, a nurse who had worked for many years at a veterans hospital outside Burlington. She wrote to tell me that a patient of hers, a man with no family listed, who had lived at that hospital, in and out of care for the better part of 3 decades. He had been found alive, badly injured, after the search parties had already gone home, found by a farmer 6 days after the army called off the search, in country that had not yet had time to hear the news. It took him nearly a year in hospitals to recover enough to speak clearly, to remember his own name with certainty, to walk without a cane. By the time he was well enough to write to me, he told Nurse Marsh he had already read, in a 3-month-old newspaper someone left in the hospital day room, the announcement of my engagement to Walter Whitfield. He did not know that I had waited 2 years past the point when everyone told me hope was foolish. He did not know that I still wore his mother's ring on a chain most nights, even after I was married. He made the decision, in that hospital day room, that the kindest thing he could do for me was let me believe he was gone, rather than return and unravel a life I had already, painfully, rebuilt. He never married. He never had children. He lived 30 more years believing him dead. Neither of us was right. Both of us, I think, were simply trying to survive a loss too large to hold any other way. Mara realized she was crying, quietly, without quite noticing when it had started, tears dropping onto the old paper in dark, spreading spots. Below her, the thunder rolled again, closer now, and the first fat drops of rain began to tick against the hallway window. She thought of every dinner conversation she'd ever half listened to as a teenager, every time her grandmother had gone quiet during old movies about soldiers coming home, every unremarked upon afternoon Eleanor had spent alone in the orchard for no reason anyone ever asked about. She thought about how a person could carry something this enormous through 60 years of ordinary life, through Sunday dinners and school recitals and a 31-year marriage to a good, steady man, and never once let the weight of it show on the surface. It made Mara ashamed, a little, of how simple she'd always assumed her grandmother's life had been. Widowed young, remarried sensibly, content with pie crusts and church socials. She understood now that contentment and grief could occupy the very same rooms of a person for decades without ever fully resolving into one or the other. She thought, too, about the small, sharp cruelty of timing, how Samuel had made the loneliest decision of his life based on a single newspaper notice, months out of date, without ever knowing how long Eleanor had actually waited, or how much of her heart she'd kept folded away even after her wedding day. One piece of information, arriving a year too late or a year too early, had cost 2 people 30 years they might otherwise have spent finding their way back to each other. That small wooden box that had belonged to Samuel, his only possessions from 30 years at that hospital. Inside it was every letter I had ever sent him, kept through every transfer, every hospital, every year. And one more item, a single sheet of paper, folded many times, soft as cloth from handling, on which he had written and rewritten, judging by the crossed-out lines, the same short passage over what must have been years. If Ellie ever has a granddaughter, and if that girl is given my mother's name the way we once promised each other on a porch in July, then some part of me got to keep that promise after all, even from this distance, even after everything. Tell her, whoever finds this, please tell her, that a man she never met loved her grandmother enough to let her go, and loved the idea of her enough to hope, for 30 years, that she'd be born into a family that still remembered how to love someone that patiently. If she ever finds her way into that old house, into the room they gave me above the porch the summer I asked Ellie to marry me, the room with the window that looks toward the orchard, I hope she'll understand that some rooms stay closed not because there's nothing inside worth finding, but because the people who love us are waiting for exactly the right person to open the door. I sealed that room the week the nurse's letter arrived, Mara. I could not bear to walk past it, and I could not bear to empty it, so I did the only thing my grief allowed. I closed the door, and I kept the key, and not for anyone else in this family, for you, specifically, by name, the way Samuel and I had once promised each other on a July evening neither of us knew would be one of the last easy evenings we'd ever share. I do not know how old you'll be when you read this. I do not know what will have brought you back to this house, or what you'll be looking for when you find this letter, if you find it at all. I only know that I have spent 30 years since that nurse's letter arrived believing, the way Samuel once believed in a hospital day room. The key is taped beneath the bottom drawer of the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. You'll have to reach up and feel for it. I didn't want it findable by accident. Open the room, Mara. It has been waiting for you longer than you've been alive. All my love, across every year between us. Your grandmother, Eleanor. Mara sat in the darkened hallway for a long time after she finished reading, letter loose in her lap, rain now coming steady against the old glass windows, the kind of rain that turns a farmhouse into an island.
She thought about all the ordinary Sundays of her childhood, the bread baking, the porch swing, her grandmother humming some tune from a decade Mara had never bothered to place, and she wondered how many of those quiet moments had been carrying, underneath them, a grief this enormous, this carefully folded away. She found the cedar chest exactly where the letter said. Her fingers, reaching blind beneath the bottom drawer, found first dust, then the brittle edge of old tape, and then, cold, small and startlingly real, against her palm, a brass key.
The lock, when she finally stood in front of that narrow door at the end of the hallway, turned easily, as though it had been oiled recently, as though someone had kept it ready even while keeping it shut. The room smelled of cedar and old paper, and, faintly, beneath everything else, of rain. Because the single window above the porch had been left open a crack, Mara realized, for who knew how many years, just enough to let the seasons move gently through the room, instead of letting it go stale and dead. A narrow bed, neatly made, sat under that window, and on the wall above the desk, in a plain wooden frame, hung a single photograph. A young man in a work shirt, laughing at something outside the camera's frame, standing in front of Colby's General Store on a summer day that had happened 60-some years before Mara was born. He had her grandmother's smile in his eyes. No, Mara corrected herself, standing very still in the doorway. Her grandmother had Colby. A pair of work boots, laces still tied, stood by the door as if their owner had only just stepped out of them. On the desk, beside the dead fountain pen, sat a small tin ashtray holding nothing but a single pressed apple blossom, flattened and the color of old paper, saved, Mara guessed, from some long-ago afternoon in the orchard below the window. She understood, standing there, that this room had never really belonged to a ghost. It belonged to a 23-year-old man who had once been given the room above the porch for a season, who had left his boots by the door meaning to come back for them, and who had spent the next 60 years of his life a few dozen miles away, in a hospital bed, believing he'd made the generous choice by staying silent. There was nothing frightening in the room at all. There was only the particular, aching stillness of a life interrupted mid-sentence. Careful, deliberate. Clearly written more recently, though still, she guessed, some years old. She opened it standing in the doorway of a room that had waited for her since before she was born. Mara, if you're reading this, you've already read the longer letter, so I won't repeat myself. I only want to say, I am not asking you to grieve a man you never knew, or a version of my life that never happened. I am asking you to understand that love, real love, doesn't always get the ending it deserves, and that doesn't make it any less true or any less worth keeping safe. I kept this room closed for 30 years, not out of sorrow, but out of hope. Hope that someday the right person would open that door and understand, all at once, that she had been loved before she ever existed. That's you, my girl. It was always going to be you. Do whatever you want with this room. Turn it into a library, a sewing room, anything that makes you happy. Samuel would have liked that better than a shrine. I think he was never a man for sitting still. Just don't be afraid of what you found here. I love you more than pie, which, as you know, is saying something. Grandma. Mara laughed, a small, wet, startled sound, because that last line was so entirely, unmistakably her grandmother that for one warm, impossible second, it felt as though Eleanor was standing right there in the doorway with her, watching the rain move in soft grey sheets across the orchard. She crossed the room and opened the window the rest of the way, letting the smell of wet earth and apple trees pour in, letting the smell of wet earth. Outside, the storm was already beginning to ease, the way storms in the hollow always did by nightfall, leaving behind that particular hush that settles over old farmland after rain. Crickets finding their courage again, the drip of water off the porch eaves, the sky clearing by slow degrees to show a few early stars. Mara sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, both letters in her lap, and looked at the photograph of a young man she would never meet, who had loved her before he had any right to, who had kept a promise across a distance of decades because it was the only piece of the future he was ever allowed to touch. She thought about how strange and how tender it was to be so completely unknowingly loved by two people from a world that no longer existed. A farmhouse before the highway came through, a general store that had closed sometime in the 80s, a young couple on a porch swing who couldn't have known that the truest thing they'd ever do together was hand their hope forward to someone who wouldn't be born for another 30 years. She would keep the room, she decided, not as it was. Eleanor was right about that. Samuel wouldn't have wanted a shrine.
Maybe she'd bring a desk of her own and write there sometimes, in a room two people had loved her into existence for, long before she ever knew their names. Downstairs, the last of the storm rolled off toward the ridge, and the farmhouse settled into the kind of stillness that only comes after something long held has finally been set down. Mara turned off the hallway light, letters tucked safely against her chest, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Miller's Hollow, she felt the house exhale.
Not grand ones. She had never been the type for grand gestures, had always been faintly suspicious of people who made big declarations before they'd earned the right to keep them. But small ones, the kind Samuel Ward had made on a porch in July, and kept, in his own quiet and mistaken way, for the rest of his life. The kind Eleanor had made to a letter she wasn't sure would ever be read, folding hope into an envelope and trusting the shape of a house to hold it safe for 30 years. She thought about the life she'd built for herself back in Boston, efficient, careful, allergic to exactly the kind of uncertainty her grandmother had lived inside for 6 decades. She thought about the fewer surprises, fewer rooms a person could get locked inside of, waiting for someone who might never come. Sitting now in a room built entirely out of one unfinished promise, she wondered, for the first time in a long while, whether she'd built her own life a little too carefully, whether there was a version of herself, somewhere, still waiting on a porch of her own for a door she hadn't let herself open yet. It wasn't an answer. It was only a question, small and quiet, the kind her grandmother's letter had taught her to recognize as worth keeping, instead of rushing past. She decided, sitting there in the last blue light before full dark, that she would let herself sit with it a while, the way this room had sat, patiently, faithfully, for 64 years, waiting for exactly the right person to finally walk through the door. And whatever had waited so patiently, for so many years, to be found, had, at last, been found and welcomed home.